policy imposed, and with such force that great leaders have to come and genuflect to Murdoch.
TCI is the nation's largest cable provider, a kind of gatekeeper that decides which channels get carried and which don't get carried. As you can imagine, that makes them a very powerful part of the media system. TCI is owned by a man called John Malone. He gets right-wing channels like the National Empowerment Channel onto his cable system, but he can and does keep out any left-wing equivalent.
One thing that's always interested me is how the conservative critics of the media, who allege that the media are liberal, have a tendency to ignore ownership. They sort of pretend that the media are controlled by Dan Rather and Peter Jennings and these people down at the bottom of the power hierarchy in the media.
We're entering the new millennium with just a few huge companies, Time Warner, ABC Disney, Murdoch's News International, Viacom, that own not just the news media, but the entire culture, from record labels to magazines to film studios to cable TV stations. We've seen a massive concentration of power in other industries too, but with media, the dangers of that narrowing are much more troubling. Another important filter is advertising. As they say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In a commercial media system, the person who pays is the advertiser. Magazines get about 50% of their revenue from advertising, press gets about 80%, and with radio and TV, it's pretty much close to 100%. If you run a news organisation, these are people you can't afford to offend.
Like other corporations, they sell a product to a market. In their case, the market is advertisers, other businesses. The product is audiences. Well, if you just look at the basic institutional structure of that system, and a rational person will ask, what kind of news and interpretation is going to come out of this? Well, the picture of the world that's going to come out is going to be one that's supportive to the needs and interests of the sellers, the buyers.
In its impact on the media, advertisers affect them mainly by wanting a proper environment. They don't intervene directly too often, but mainly they tell the media what they want. The media are in fact soliciting them. They know what they want, so there's a constant interplay. But sometimes programs are produced that they don't like ex post, and they come along and they complain. In the case, for example, this little newspaper had an article on automobile buying and said that this is a seller's market, and the new car dealers are asking for a 7.5% profit margin, but if you're smart and bargain with them, you can get it down to half that. And the auto dealers in the area were furious, and they raised Cain, they complained, they started an advertising boycott, and the publisher, this little newspaper, issued a public apology and said they were all wrong. One station manager of a TV station in Boston was quoted a year or so ago saying that since auto advertisements are about 25% of local advertising, it is an unwritten rule that you will never discuss buying autos and make any critique of the process of buying autos. It's an unwritten rule.
The Chrysler company, for example, they sent out a letter to the magazines they advertise in. Chrysler's a big company, so that's a lot of magazines. And that letter insisted that they send their articles to Chrysler in advance so that they could screen them in order to see if they were suitable. If they didn't like the articles, they'd pull the ads. It's what we might call corporate censorship.
Some of the prime advertisers actually have a powerful influence on public broadcasting too, because in the desire to curb public broadcasting, to keep it within proper bounds, conservatives have kept its funding in short supply. During the Reagan years, there was a very sharp cutback of funding for PBS and a real attempt to push them into the commercial nexus. So who comes into the picture to fund PBS? Well, the advertising community.
Welcome to Mobile Masterpiece Theatre. For nearly 30 years, we've been proud to provide the energy that helps public television run.
What has happened over the years in PBS is that their regular public affairs programs have become very conservative dominated, and it's partly because there's money there that will fund those programs. General Electric, which has its own network, funds the McLaughlin show, which is on every week, and Tony Brown, a black Republican who's on every week. So that even on PBS, which is supposed to be the focal point of liberalism, conservatives dominate. One could argue that the evolution of the American television system is really a case study in the evolution of what happens when you have advertising dominating a media system. Another important filter is sourcing. The media depend on a steady stream of news, and they come to rely on powerful sources who can give them this regular news. The media locate reporters with regular beats to these primary news sources.
David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
Bob Schieffer, CBS News at the Capitol.
John Donvan, ABC News at the White House.
If there's some source that gives out news every day or regularly, and this source is credible so that you can offer the news without worrying about whether it's going to be even true or false, that's very economical. We recently had this experience with Mr. Clinton's calling of this voluntarism summit.
We need an era of big citizenship. That is why we are here.
He announced that voluntarism was taking a new importance in the United States, and he got some very important dignitaries like General Colin Powell to be one of the sponsors. It had headlines day after day on this marvelous, wonderful event. It was made newsworthy by the fact that the President of the United States was pushing it and got dignitaries. Its substance was not given close attention. And of course there were protesters at the summit convention, but they were marginalized, although they're making a very, very little good point, namely that the people who were sponsoring the conference had just passed a ghastly so-called welfare reform bill that was going to push millions of people into the need for volunteers. So it was, in a sense, a huge hypocritical operation. But the media took it at face value because it was peddled by dominant sources, primary definers who defined what was news.
Journalists are not supposed to express their opinions. Opinions are supposed to be on the editorial pages. On the front page you have news. But of course, everyone who thinks knows that's mostly meaningless. Journalists do express opinions, but they don't put them in their own words. So the way to express an opinion is to go to an expert and ask the expert, what do you think about such and such? And then you quote the expert. That's not your opinion. You're quoting the expert. It's objective. But of course, you choose the experts properly so that they will express the acceptable opinions.
There's always a problem of who is going to be the experts. It could be that dissidents would be experts. Since that presents a problem, conservatives have frequently organized think tanks at which experts will be cultivated who meet the conservative standard. Institutions like the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies is a think tank that's specialized in international affairs. And it was in a revolving door relationship with the CIA and the State Department. Same thing has been true of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a very important corporate-funded think tank that sponsors economists and political scientists and others who are very conservative and speak the corporate line.
There have been a number of studies of the experts who are used by the news media. Time and time again, the people who come out on top in these studies are right-wingers. One of the recent studies looked at all the think tanks quoted by major media in 1995. Top of the list, cited over 2,000 times, came the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation makes no pretense of being anything other than a voice of conservative right-wing thought. In fact, what this study showed was that 3 of the top 4 on the list were solidly conservative, corporate-funded think tanks.
Okay, we're down to the finals for classics, and it is against Zach Sharp and Terry Groves. Terry Groves is a local player from Battle Creek, Michigan. Zach Sharp is a world-renowned nice guy, he says. I believe him. He's travels to all the football shows, so it's going to be local down against the Raiders family. We'll see what happens. And here is our team, so he gets to pick the first game. For third and fourth, it's going to be Bob and Bob gets to pick.